People don't decide whether to cross your boundaries in the moment. They decide long before that, by watching how you respond to small acts of disrespect. Every time you ignore something that shouldn't be ignored, every time you tolerate what you secretly resent, every time you sacrifice your principles just to keep the peace, you're teaching people exactly how far they can push you. The uncomfortable truth is that respect is rarely lost all at once. It's negotiated one small compromise at a time. Think about this. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to disrespect you completely. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, through a series of small tests that most people never even notice they're conducting. A friend cancels plans at the last minute, and you say it's fine. A coworker takes credit for something you built, and you let it slide because confrontation feels exhausting. A family member assumes you'll drop everything for them again because you always have. None of these moments feel significant on their own, but together they form a pattern, and people are always watching the pattern, even when they pretend not to be. Here's what changes everything once you understand it. Human beings are constantly running a quiet calculation about everyone they interact with. Not consciously, not maliciously in most cases. It's simply how social instinct works. They watch what you say you'll tolerate, and then they watch what you actually tolerate, and the gap between those two things becomes the space they operate in. If you say you value your time but answer every message within seconds regardless of the hour, people learn your real policy. If you say you won't be taken for granted but keep showing up anyway, people learn your real policy. Your stated principles mean very little. Your demonstrated principles mean everything. Pay close attention to what this means for the way you're treated. It means the way people behave toward you is not random. It is a direct reflection of what you have shown them is acceptable. This is not a comfortable idea, because it removes the excuse of blaming other people entirely for how you're treated. It places a portion of that responsibility back on you, not because you deserve mistreatment, but because your response, or lack of one, becomes part of the information other people use to decide what they can get away with next. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. How many of your current relationships were shaped not by what you wanted, but by what you were too tired, too polite, or too afraid to correct? Most people never trace their frustration back to its true origin. They feel resentment toward the coworker who dumps extra work on them, but they never examine the fact that they said yes 17 times before this one. They feel hurt by the partner who stopped asking what they wanted, but they never examine the years of quietly going along with decisions they disagreed with. Resentment is often just delayed accountability. It's the price paid for a boundary that was never actually set. This is where people make a costly mistake. They believe the solution to being taken advantage of is more intensity, louder arguments, sharper reactions, dramatic confrontations that finally put people in their place. But intensity is rarely what earns lasting respect. In fact, it often does the opposite. Emotional outbursts signal that you can be destabilized, that enough pressure applied at the right moment will make you lose control. And once someone learns that about you, they don't necessarily stop pushing. They simply learn how much pressure it takes, and they factor that number into how they treat you going forward. The trait that actually makes people think twice is something quieter and far more difficult to cultivate. It is quiet conviction, not aggression, not intimidation, not the need to prove a point every time you're challenged. Quiet conviction is the unwavering consistency between what you believe, what you tolerate, and how you respond. It's the trait people sense in someone before they've even tested them, and it's the reason certain people are simply never chosen as targets for manipulation, guilt, or quiet exploitation, while others seem to attract it no matter how kind or intelligent they are. Look carefully at your own life and you'll notice this pattern already at work, just not in your favor yet. There is likely someone in your circle who rarely gets pushed around, not because they're the strongest, the richest, or the most aggressive person in the room, but because there is a stillness to them. They don't over-explain their decisions. They don't chase approval when someone disagrees with them. They don't perform outrage to prove they're serious. And somehow, people tread more carefully around them than they do around people who shout much louder. That stillness is not passivity. It is the visible outer layer of a person whose internal principles do not bend depending on who is watching. This is why Machiavelli's thinking on perception remains so useful, stripped of its historical context, and applied directly to modern life. He understood that how you are perceived becomes the operating reality other people respond to, regardless of your private intentions. If you are perceived as someone whose boundaries shift under pressure, people will apply pressure. If you are perceived as someone whose values remain fixed regardless of mood, guilt, flattery, or inconvenience, people recalibrate their behavior around that fixed point instead of testing it. Perception is not vanity. It is strategy. And the perception you build through your smallest daily reactions becomes the framework other people use to decide how far they can go. Think about the coworker who slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins routing their unfinished tasks to your desk. It rarely starts as an obvious imposition. It starts as a favor, then a pattern, then an expectation. By the time you notice what's happening, saying no feels disproportionate because so much precedent has already been set. The uncomfortable truth is that they didn't choose you at random. They chose you because something in your early responses signaled that you would absorb the extra weight without resistance. Not because you're weak. Often it's the most capable, most conscientious people this happens to, but because competence without boundaries reads as availability. Consider the friend who repeatedly cancels plans, always with a reasonable-sounding excuse, always expecting the friendship to remain exactly as warm as before. Most people respond by either exploding after the fifth cancellation, which reads as disproportionate and gets dismissed as an overreaction, or quietly accepting it while privately keeping score, which builds resentment without ever changing the dynamic. Neither approach comes from conviction. Conviction looks different. It sounds like calmly adjusting your own expectations and availability to match what has actually been demonstrated without announcing it, without punishing them for it, and without needing them to acknowledge the shift. You simply stop making yourself as available because their behavior has already told you what the friendship currently is. What happens next surprises most people. When you stop reacting emotionally and start responding according to a fixed internal standard, something shifts in how others engage with you. Calm responses create psychological uncertainty in people who are used to provoking a reaction. If someone expects you to argue, and instead you simply state your position once and hold it without escalating, they don't know what to do with that. Arguments require two participants performing intensity at each other. Conviction requires only one person who isn't performing at all. This unpredictability, from their perspective, is deeply unsettling because it removes their ability to predict and therefore control the interaction. This is the hidden relationship between self-respect and external respect that most people never think through carefully. External respect is not something other people simply decide to give you based on your qualifications, your kindness, or your effort. It is largely a mirror of the respect you visibly hold for yourself. If you consistently prioritize other people's comfort over your own well-being, if you consistently apologize for needs that don't require an apology, if you consistently allow your time, energy, and attention to be treated as infinitely available, you are teaching the people around you exactly how much your own needs matter to you. And people calibrate their treatment of you according to that lesson, whether they're conscious of doing it or not. Now think about romantic relationships, where this dynamic often plays out with the highest emotional stakes. There is a particular kind of relationship where one partner quietly, gradually pushes further into the other's boundaries, more control over decisions, less consideration during conflict, a growing assumption that their preferences simply outweigh their partners. This rarely begins as cruelty. It begins as testing, often unconsciously, to see what will be allowed. The partner who eventually loses themselves in that dynamic is usually not the less intelligent or less capable one. They are the one who mistook keeping the peace for keeping the relationship, not realizing that peace built on suppressed disagreement is not peace at all. It's a slow erosion that eventually collapses under its own weight. Here's what changes everything about how you handle this. The difference between confidence and arrogance is not intensity, it's origin. Arrogance needs an audience. It performs superiority because it's trying to convince someone, often including itself. Confidence, the quiet kind rooted in real conviction, doesn't need anyone to witness it in order to remain true. A person with quiet conviction doesn't need to announce their boundaries loudly because they don't need external validation that the boundary is legitimate. They already know. This is precisely why conviction is more intimidating than aggression. Aggression can be met with aggression, matched and escalated. Conviction cannot be argued with because it isn't asking for agreement. It's simply describing reality as that person has decided to live it. Most people never notice how much of their reputation is built not through what they say about themselves, but through what they repeatedly do when no one is forcing them to explain it. Reputation is not a story you tell. It is a pattern other people observe and then quietly trust as predictive of future behavior. If you consistently follow through on what you say, people begin to trust your word without needing proof each time. If you consistently maintain the same standard whether you're being watched or not, people begin to trust your character without needing to test it repeatedly. This is why emotionally disciplined people rarely need to prove themselves in the moment. Their reputation has already done the proving, built silently over every past interaction where their behavior matched their stated values. The psychology of consequences matters here more than most people realize. Every time a boundary is crossed and nothing changes in response, you are not just tolerating one incident, you are training the other person's expectations for every future incident. This is why kindness without boundaries eventually becomes permission, even though that was never the intention behind the kindness. A parent who repeatedly gives in after saying no is not teaching patience, they're teaching persistence works. A person who repeatedly forgives without ever adjusting their trust is not teaching grace, they're teaching that actions carry no real cost. This isn't about punishment or keeping score. It's about understanding that consistency between your words and your actual responses is the single mechanism through which other people learn how to treat you. Now ask yourself what happens to someone who never develops this. They become the default person everyone quietly relies on to absorb whatever others don't want to deal with: the extra work, the emotional labor, the last-minute change of plans, the compromise that always seems to fall on their side of the table. They are often hardworking, likable, and deeply capable, which is exactly why this happens to them. Their competence and their agreeableness get mistaken by others, and eventually by themselves, for a lack of limits. Over time, this produces a specific and quiet kind of exhaustion, not the visible burnout of one dramatic event, but the slow accumulation of 1,000 moments where their own needs were set aside, because saying so felt like too much friction to introduce. This is why unpredictable emotional reactions invite challenges rather than preventing them. If your response to being pushed depends on your mood, your stress level, or how much patience you have left that day, people learn to simply wait for the moments when your guard is down. Consistency removes that opportunity entirely. When your standard doesn't fluctuate with your emotional state, there is no version of you to wait out. This is what remaining composed under pressure actually protects, not your image, but the reliability of the signal you're sending about what will and won't be tolerated. Look at how this plays out in leadership, in business, in any environment where influence is being negotiated constantly beneath the surface. The leader who reacts defensively to every challenge, who needs to win every disagreement, who raises their voice when questioned, is often perceived as insecure regardless of their actual authority. The leader who listens, states their position clearly once, and holds that position without needing to dominate the conversation is perceived as someone operating from genuine strength. Their authority isn't performed. It's assumed, because their behavior has already demonstrated it doesn't require performance to remain intact. This is why people observe your standards before they decide how to treat you, often long before you're aware you're being evaluated. New relationships, friendships, romantic partnerships, professional dynamics are quietly shaped in their earliest days by what you allow, what you correct, and what you let pass without comment. This is not about being difficult or guarded from the very beginning. It's about understanding that every early interaction is establishing a baseline, and baselines are far easier to set at the start than to renegotiate later, once a pattern has already calcified into an expectation. The uncomfortable truth underneath all of this is simple. If you don't define your own standards, other people will define them for you, and they will almost always define them in whatever way is most convenient for themselves. This isn't cynicism about human nature. It's simply an honest acknowledgement of how social dynamics actually operate. People are not obligated to protect boundaries you never articulated and never enforced. That responsibility belongs to you alone, and no amount of hoping to be understood will substitute for actually being consistent. Quiet conviction, once built, becomes almost impossible to dismantle because it isn't dependent on anyone else's cooperation. It doesn't require the other person to apologize, to change, or even to acknowledge what happened. It only requires you to remain the same person regardless of how much pressure, guilt, or charm is applied against you. This is precisely why it unsettles people who are used to negotiating their way around others' resistance. They can push against anger. They can outlast guilt. They can wear down inconsistency. But they cannot argue with someone who was never negotiating in the first place. The people who command the deepest respect are rarely the loudest, the most intimidating, or the most aggressive. They simply become known for one thing: their principles do not change under pressure. They don't threaten. They don't chase approval. They don't argue endlessly. They quietly stand by what they believe, and over time the world adjusts to them instead of the other way around. That is the trait that makes people think twice before crossing you, not fear of your anger, but certainty about your character.